Hello everyone, today we read and comment the second chapter of the fourth book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Character of the Modern Battle. The text follows. According to the notion we have formed of tactics and strategy, it follows as a matter of course that if the nature of the former is changed, that change must have an influence on the latter. If tactical facts in one case are entirely different from those in another, then the strategic must be so also if they are to continue consistent and reasonable. It is therefore important to characterize a general action in its modern form before we advance with the study of its employment in strategy. What do we do now usually in a great battle? We place ourselves quietly in the great masses arranged contiguous to and behind one another. We deploy relatively only a small portion of the wall and let it wring itself out in a fire combat which lasts for several hours, only interrupted now and again, and removed hither and thither by separate small shocks from charges with bayonet and cavalry attacks. When this line has gradually exhausted part of its warlike ardor in this manner, and there remains nothing more than the cinders, it is withdrawn and replaced by another. In this manner the battle on a modified principle burns slowly away like wet powder, and if the veil of night commands it to stop, because neither party can any longer see, and neither chooses to run the risk of blind chance, then an account is taken by each side respectively of the masses remaining, which can be called still effective, that is, which have not yet quite collapsed like the extinct volcanoes. Account is taken of the ground gained or lost, and of how stands the security of the rear. These results with special impressions as to bravery and cowardice, ability and stupidity, which are thought to have been observed in ourselves and in the enemy, are collected into one single total impression, out of which there springs the resolution to quit the field, or to renew the combat on the morrow. This description, which is not intended as finished picture of a modern battle, but only to give its general tone, suits for the offensive and defensive and the special traits which are given by the object proposed, the country, etc., may be introduced to it, without materially altering the conception. But modern battles are not so by accidents, they are so because the parties find themselves nearly on a level as regards military organization and the knowledge of the art of war, and because the warlike element inflamed by great national interests has broken through artificial limits and now flows in its natural channel. Under these two conditions, battles will always preserve this character. This general idea of the modern battle will be useful to us in the sequel in more places than one, if we want to estimate the value of the particular coefficients of strength, country, etc. It is only for general, great, and decisive combats, and such as come near to them, that this description stands good. Inferior ones have changed their character also in the same direction, but less than great ones. The proof of this belongs to tactics. We shall, however, have an opportunity hereafter of making this subject plainer by giving a few particulars. So, this chapter is fundamentally a statement on the character of modern battle, from the point of view particularly of dynamics fundamentally, and how the relation of forces is entailed. And there is an aspect of this that is quite fascinating that we have observed also for other videos, that consists in the historicistic perspective that von Clausewitz introduces, for which he is somewhat criticized by some, that misinterpret the Vom Kriege as essentially a military theory based on the contingent early 19th century warfare like in Western Europe, and that fundamentally neglects the further developments in the art of warfare in the West and more extensively globally. And we have already corrected and explained this mistake, why it's believed, what's the point that is often assumed with von Clausewitz's works, and refuted it. And today we'll take the chance to observe more in detail what this thing is about, at least from a certain point of view. That consists fundamentally in, first of all, I think the most important statement here from Clausewitz makes, for the sake at least of this historicistic perspective, is that, he says, we fight battles like this today. This has an impact on strategy, and we'll have to see how this follows, but naturally this thing can change. He states it expressly. And also, however, he makes a further point, that is to say, look, that from our times onwards, we have reached a certain level of sophistication of the military art, for which certain limits that were previously given for political and social reasons to the employment of armed forces have been surpassed. In other words, with national statal armies, we have channeled this popular force in a way it had never been accomplished before, and this naturally produces some consequences. And as long as things will remain like this, in fact, the character of the battle will fundamentally maintain itself like it. Naturally, von Clausewitz was right, and then he goes on in explaining fundamentally, in fact, a typical early 19th century battle. However, bearing in mind that in this regard he is not attaching to the specific tactics, like, unit tactics that he is exemplifying here, like the bayonet cavalry and the use of the line of the reserve, etc. Like the battles are fought in this way because of that specific political and social dimension that is being traced there. What does this really mean? Well, it means that in many ways we still live in the nation state in the early 21st century. And even though this is naturally transforming, in many ways, fundamentally, warfare, as von Clausewitz is described by von Clausewitz, is fundamentally the same. Like, that is, we have been through a lot of stuff. Our world has definitely changed a big deal from von Clausewitz times, but substantially that same capability of fielding, this overwhelming nationally scaled, we could say, amount of moral and material and physical forces is fundamentally the same, right? We're not dueling under monarchs that need to pay this professional troops in contained numbers with relatively low in intensity of war, at least for throwing randomly, Lutvakian term, but we'll have to criticize that at some point as well. We are talking about the possibility of major scale wars, in fact, that we just don't go much into anymore, thanks to nuclear weapons, thanks to the deterrence that has been posed by that, but that intrinsically it's still what is pushing, in fact, even the same usage of or at least in fact deterrence of nuclear weapons. And in this sense not much has changed. Like, that passage we could trace from tribal organization to the central, fully centralized statal one has been accomplished. And in many ways the war, and therefore in its temporary character, which could change again, like maybe will be a nuclear war sometime, hopefully not soon, that will revert us back to tribal, to tribal structures. Who knows? That's possible. But the point is that as long as the characters are these ones, the current ones, well, war will function more or less like this, right? And naturally, as you know, a lot of other factors bring different changes in how wars are fought. Von Clausewitz is the first one is telling you since the very beginning of the work that that there is no war that is fought ever in the same way by definition. So even the character of the modern battle that he's exemplifying here, both tactically and strategically, at least for its consequences, as he points out, is fundamentally like just a type that he states himself like it's not always like this. And this is, by the way, just for major battles, and something that intuitively is something that would remain unburied in many ways, like in World War the First, right? Do you think that von Clausewitz, there is a powerful digression we could make of the criticism that's been moved from Clausewitz in terms of World War the First, like, idiocies such as that he even caused World War the First himself, and all these asinine misinterpretations of the same Clausewitzian theory applied to actual history. Like, if you study World War the First, that's like war as von Clausewitz has described it. There is nothing, theoretical in there that doesn't work as it described war. And he's just stating here explicitly that, for his own time, he was, the armies were fighting that way in the West. And, when other factors will change, more or less, the thing will differ. So what are you searching for, and especially what should have von Clausewitz done? Like trying, to look at the crystal ball and wondering how wars would have been fought in the future. Like, is this something that we do today, or that we have any, intelligent, practical, side for which we should care about it? Like, of course, we look at future warfare, ideally just for saying, okay, let's try to guess where the thing will evolve from and invest accordingly. But, how do you think this decisional processes happen? Like, we picture how warfare will be in 100 years and behave accordingly. Of course, we go step by step, so much as they were doing at the time. And the more the world grew complex, and the more it's difficult to predict at a longer term, and even in there we always get surprised, even for things that we thought would be predictable and that actually weren't. So the whole criticism, the critical structure is often employed to against the Vom Kriege with this terms is it's perfectly useless. And it doesn't take in consideration that the broader point that von Clausewitz is doing, that is, that there's a deep connection between the form of politics and society and how wars are fought. And this condition, strategy, battles, right? And von Clausewitz is just telling you, and you should be thankful for that, he's telling you how early 19th century warfare was, from a person that had tested it in first person pretty damn directly, and even in position of command, in the most atrocious context imaginable. But no, let's criticize von Clausewitz because who knows? We want to feel that we are better, we're special, like, because now we are like 20 to 200 years later. Like, what's the deal of this? Try to understand what's the deeper point of the work, and then maybe come up with some idea that doesn't leave you much of an option at this point, because we have already observed how the Clausewitzian concept is absolute in the sense that it covers all the oscillations that war as a broader political phenomenon enacts in reality, in real history, in things that happen since the beginning of warfare, right, to this very day, right? And you can't judge the Vom Kriege because von Clausewitz points out that at his time, for the sake of something that even if he was interested at the time, he points out that warfare had arrived to that point. And if you have studied the history of warfare, and you realized what Napoleonic wars had been about, it weren't just other random wars. These things had hinged the way war was fought, that in this sense the nature of warfare never changes, but the way it's fought, it does. Like, and for the time was an enormous deal, because there had never been anything so devastating like Napoleonic warfare in a broader scale of the nature of the conflict first, and then of the wars and the way they were fought properly. So this was most obviously an enormous deal, and von Clausewitz was writing at this point also from a from a moment in which the thing had been over, and the still Europe, in spite of the restoration, had been deeply shaken by this, and there were a lot of questions to be yet to be answered. Also, in terms of what to do about the older system, and especially, how, say, would this last? Would this leave an option for change that couldn't be dramatic? We know actually the history of the 19th century is actually very dramatic. Some people picture it as 19th century. After all, it was a Pacific century, right, in Europe. Are you kidding me? Like, the 19th century Pacific. Restudy. Just if it's just about European history, but aside from the rest of the world, of course, that wasn't a peaceful century at all, and it was traversed by a dramatic set of conflicts that broke out in open warfare that were utterly devastating. But in any case, he describes now what the broader deal of these major battles was. And he writes, okay, so character of the modern battle. According to the notion we have formed of tactics and strategy, it follows, as a matter of course, that if the nature of the former is changed, that change must have an influence on the latter. Right? We have seen the mutual influence of between tactics and strategy, how these two interact, and how naturally, if the nature of combat changes, so the one of strategy does. Von Clausewitz then writes, if tactical facts in one case are entirely different from those in another, then the strategic must be so also if they are to continue consistent and reasonable. It is therefore important to characterize a general action in its modern form before we advance with a study of its employment in strategy. So that this type of warfare naturally has to always keep in mind what we have in the relation between the combat and the way this combat is used, is employed strategically. And therefore, von Clausewitz focuses more properly on this kind of broader employment of forces compared to previous times that, according to him, had been fundamentally kept away from the field, in part, like up to the national statal warfare. Loss of moral and physical forces had deliberately kept out. This is a heavy political statement, of course, because there is all the the destruction of Prussia by the French, the creation of a nationally based army in 1813, and the victory, of course, of Prussia against Napoleon together with the Allies, and therefore all what passed through in terms of a different military culture that the same von Clausewitz together with von Scharnhorst and other thinkers had contributed to enforce. So naturally he felt very much his not just his intuitions for the work, but properly the historical context from which these had emerged. So this also explains why he is talking specifically about this type of war. Once again, it's not a matter of narrowing the spectrum of warfare down to early 18th century to the early 19th century one. It's to properly realize that the unleashment of these forces is not over yet, and that this actually has even more increased over time, because warfare was naturally much less devastating in the early 19th century, would be in the early 20th century, or in the early 21st century, for that matter. So this has even a greater importance. Like, even if von Clausewitz couldn't envisage what would happen in the future in terms of, I don't know, nuclear warfare and all this stuff, still, this doesn't diminish at all the point he's making here, because he's simply telling you that, look, that the more this thing is, widened in terms of power involved, and more warfare in this sense becomes a matter of those morals, first of all, in physical strengths that head towards a more purely violent employment of the same, that naturally require also much greater means, but that these are already the product of a political and social reality that is able to enforce them. So what he's telling you here is that, be careful about what is going on, and starting from how these wars are fought. And this is the object of the Vom Kriege, to make people aware what fundamentally war is, and how, so that if you find yourself into one, at least you know what this is about, what you should be doing to come out of it, and then that's up to you. And this is a very deep message, because it entrusts an enormous faith in human conscience and in understanding, right? And therefore also every interpretation that is aimed at seeing in von Clausewitz a progenitor of certain ideologies, including, I don't know, National Socialism or this stuff, aside from the fact that, just to look at what, how more spread what, Clausewitz and strategic culture was spread, I don't know, among the Marxist-Leninists during the 20th century, compared to National Socialism, which actually screwed up badly from a military point of view, exactly because they had completely misunderstood von Clausewitz in many ways. But aside from that, it doesn't find any place in here, right? So even that is plain stupid. And frankly, I've heard even professors in universities completely misunderstanding this point. Exchanging the fact that since von Clausewitz doesn't give a motivation for fighting war, he is legitimating basically everything, and that the fact, that a good politician should be able to use its military instrument is an accusation of militarism. That is to say, every political entity has the option of violence. This is nothing to do which color you have or what's your opinion on how you should be using the military instrument. But you hear this nodding and this nonsense, and that was specifically a philosophy professor, and I don't know what these people actually study in terms of actual historical, aside from warfare, but in general from the mere context of what this really is. Because actually the Vom Kriege, as we often reiterate, it's rather simple to understand. Like, it doesn't present many contradictions or ambiguities of things that can be misinterpreted. I mean, it just takes to actually study it. And I know that it's pretty long, because most people are lazy and they just repeat most of what others tell them. But fundamentally, here's the text. It's one of the most famous works in the whole history of mankind. Everybody can read it and study it, and we don't understand why such cultural distortions are carried out, if not maybe for political reasons themselves, like criticizing von Clausewitz like a militarist or a progenitor or totalitarianism, or other nonsensical statements that can be easily debunked just by the opening pages of the Vom Kriege. But aside from this is my usual rant against anti-Clausewitzian thoughts. But going on, von Clausewitz writes, what do we now usually do in a great battle? So, we place ourselves quietly in great masses arranged contiguous to and behind one another, so in line and plus reserves. We deploy relatively only a small portion of the wall and let it wring itself out in a fire combat which lasts for several hours, only interrupted now and again, and removed hither and thither by separate small shocks from charges with a bayonet in cavalry attacks. When this line has gradually exhausted part of its warlike ardor in this manner, and there remains nothing more than the cinders, it is withdrawn and replaced by another. Right? So it's naturally not, compared. Think about blitzkrieg or tank warfare in general, or dynamic battlefields, where certain forces can be channeled fact, and in here there was much less of a mean of offense in proportion. Still the masses in the battlefield, the battlefield is full, up to the end of the 19th century. The battlefield fundamentally is filled with this thickly packed formations that have to concentrate fire, and to it's probably with these masses that make the push through this thing, and rarely can break through unless they have this combined capability that wore each other out. In fact, with this long engagements for several hours of combative shooting, one in front of the other. Then it's not that the nature of warfare has dramatically changed. Like if you think about World War I, breakthroughs, think about the Western Front, weren't that easy either. But of course, even this is the point that the greater you look at the field from the bow, and technically, the more you approach to the strategical level, the strategical side, things do not change dramatically. Like it is mostly the way of fighting. In fact, that Von Clausewitz here concentrates on that makes the point. So the main breakthrough was to wear the enemy out, then concentrating, artillery fire, maybe on some sections of the line, to try bayonet or cavalry attacks to try to break the stasis, we could say. And however, these encounters usually they could go on even multiple days, and with reserves, with this alternation of troops. This is pretty much it. And von Clausewitz says, in this manner, the battle on a modified principle burns slowly away like wet powder, right? And if the veil of night commands it to stop, because neither party can any longer see, and neither chooses to run the risk of blind chance, then an account is taken by each side respectively of the masses remaining, which can be called still effective, that is, which have not yet quite collapsed like extinct volcanoes. Account is taken of the ground gained or lost, and how stands the security of the rear. These results with special impressions as to bravery and cowardice, ability and stupidity, which are thought to have been observed in ourselves and in the enemy, are collected into one single total impression, out of which there springs the resolution to quit the field or to renew the combat on the morrow. Right, so this is the post-battle, and is essentially assessing, of course, the losses, your own, the ones of the enemy, seeing how many troops you still have at your disposal, spotting essentially what happened on the field in terms of, was better at fighting, at commanding, and trying to foresee, partial fashion, what the next engagement could be about, and therefore deciding whether to give battle the following day or retreating, like given that the night is impeding the further movement. And also in here, not much has dramatically changed after all, right? It always maintains. We have seen, for example, the Valley of Darkness in previous books, how this fundamentally still has an impact. We will always maintain by a certain degree, even in modern combat. And then von Clausewitz says this description, which is not intended as a finished picture of a modern battle, right, but only to give its general tone, suits for the offensive and defensive, and the special traits which are given by the object proposed, the counter, etc., may be introduced to it without materially altering the conception. So naturally, here von Clausewitz stresses the fact that this is just, in fact, as he calls it, the general tone of the modern battle. That is to say, essentially, what is this about? Not much because of, the tactics employed, but rather, as you understand here, as a matter of, assessing the enemy's strength and capabilities as something definitive about that special combat, not much of other factors interfering, right? So what is spotting in this character of modern battle is a more direct, at least implicitly, for what we have read also in the previous part of the work, is not there is essentially a direct engagement. In spite of the use of reserves and a gradual effort, still, however, focuses on the general, capability, the general strength of this wall formation and how, where you can break through or not. And this is fundamentally what the wall thing is focused on. This is important because von Clausewitz doesn't descend in detail saying, now we should think of this major battles with tricks or other stratagems even, or other tactical refinements that you can't solve it. No, he is pointing at the general character of this combat, right? What this manifests itself like, given the enormous changes that had occurred up to that point in the few generations, fundamentally. And in fact, von Clausewitz writes, but modern battles are not so by accident. Like, they are so because the parties find themselves nearly on a level as regards military organization and the knowledge of the art of war, and because the warlike element inflamed by great national interests has broken through artificial limits and now flows in its natural channel. Right. This is perhaps for the sake of the Clausewitzian theory instead the single most important phrase in here, because it highlights essentially what the nature of this art of war stems from, because it's properly an accomplishment, right? We have seen how the theory of the art of war has evolved over time, and the same von Clausewitz explained to us historically. And von Clausewitz points out fundamentally that battles are fought in such a direct and, if you want, specular way, in fact, because the contendants have the same level of military organization and knowledge of the art of war, right? European armies at the time were basically all alike, right? They could differ, in fact, in the politics, in the society that stood behind them. But as for methods of combat, well, we have evolved in the West ever since. Von Clausewitz actually, he talks about Europe in general, but that's the same thing for the Western world broadly meant at that point, North America, and more. But he probably properly acknowledges the fact that the differences that in a way had that were still existing, telling the truth, between, in fact, the West, for example, and the rest of the world, are something that really changes the art, the way art of war is enacted practically, because naturally it brings to a different asymmetry, level of asymmetry that cannot be discarded, right? And von Clausewitz doesn't quite give here, up to this point at least, an explanation why, or maybe actually he did indirectly or even directly, I can't even remember, but the fact that why he addresses naturally the advanced peoples, like the Western warfare, and because simply it has gotten to this level of awareness of same nature of warfare, and it has the means to enact it in a way that, in fact, cannot be ignored at that point, and the whole history of the world did pass through Europe, like or the Western world broadly meant, and so this naturally is for the sake of practicality. Like, it's not that he excludes the rest of the world, but he says, the rest of the world still have to develop, but we know that phase in human development, and we know the fact that there are specific dynamics that von Clausewitz actually covered. So also another criticism that is usually done, von Clausewitz is not interested but in Western warfare. This is actually not true. Like, he explained how Western warfare fundamentally originated from the same base that every other people starts from, and just at this point it's the most advanced, but there is a dynamic that is going on there that is also in there kind of asymptotic, right? That every people is on this way, where in another, the same dynamics that are to be found in one army, after all, are connected to one that happens to others, right? So human societies are all comparable in their journey, and this is also very important because it von Clausewitz is perfectly aware about the existence, I don't know, of tribal warfare, and he just says, they're not so effective on certain grounds compared to other military systems. We've already been there. We know what that's about. We know about the intrinsic limits that exist at that stage of political and social development. We know what's the military thing out there, and actually, Europeans at this time knew pretty well the type of warfare. They were just concentrating on what the much greater deal had been in Europe, that had been the order which the system which had been almost overthrown, and however definitely compromised in some of its fundamental features by Napoleonic wars. There are wars. We're talking about war, right? We're not talking about some sudden weird, some change that happened, I don't know, for some unknown reason. Did this thing pass through major confrontations, millions of people killed? So it was an enormous deal. It's as if, making an anachronistic comparison, but the world after World War II, you can't reason anymore, right? Like there were before World War I. I mean, there were things that simply had never been seen before, right? Before the Battle of the Somme or Verdun, just for even just defending the leadership, the command of World War I, like nobody knew what it meant even to carry out operations like those, shooting millions of projectiles of artillery shells in a few. So think what probably from a doctrinal point of view that had meant, how much had to be learned just from those experiences, because it's very easy to criticize things that happen in the past after you have studied. Another thing is when you have to do them, nobody has ever tried them before, and we know that progress advances largely thanks to some of the most brutal failures you can ever imagine. Like the greatest human achievements are failures, or better, the greatest human failures are also the greatest achievements in many ways, because they really make you understand the hard way what that thing should be done or not, right? And therefore, is an enormous deal what happened during Napoleonic. Right? If you don't contextualize what this work stems from, you can't understand the depth and the scale of what von Clausewitz is talking about in the first place, because you don't acknowledge what we are talking about historically, right? Aside from the universal, immanent character of warfare within humanity, but what and how this thinking was originated, which is not something to be given for granted. The Vom Kriege could have not been written, but the time of idealism of the beginning of the 19th century, the philosophical, scientific accomplishments of that world where it was formulated, it couldn't be created at the time of Sun Tzu, of Pythagoras, right? Because those are entirely different things. That's just also for throwing completely out of the way any comparison between Sun Tzu's work and von Clausewitz's ones. These are not comparable things by the slightest, right? You can't compare them for the sake of literary interest, but I mean, are you really pretending? Because there are books that are being sold out there, junky books that are like von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, like who's better? Like, do you have an idea of the sheer level of scale of complexity of depth of intelligence that lays in an early 19th century Western source from the one, in fact, of a Chinese work stemming from the one of the time of Pythagoras? That do you have the slightest idea how the two things do not match, and how and why especially there has been an insane interest for Sun Tzu in the last generations, in a specific part of the West, where that stemmed from, which is incidentally also a strategical reason, by the way, the connection between the United States and Far East Asia, for obvious reasons. But what do you think this this is all about, that we are talking about relatively to this work and its consequences. This is really an enormous deal. We wouldn't be making all of this playlist because of something that had no importance, or that is just a matter of personal opinion. This stuff is really not a matter of personal opinion as far as military history or just history of mankind is concerned. Because nobody has ever come up with anything like this. Like, this thing was produced in the early 19th century. Nobody has topped this afterwards. Nobody. Right? There's not been a substantial improvement of the Clausewitzian ideas. Right? Nobody has fixed them. Nobody has corrected them. Right? And just people who, in fact, have to sell cheap books will try to make you believe so. Whereas, actually, nobody would even go as far as say, that von Clausewitz is to be overthrown away, or, just it's been surpassed. Maybe just culturalists will make you believe that, because they have much more of an academic fiction to preserve, but they are kind of the worst in this sense, and completely rotten from a scientific and deontological point of view. I just, culturalism is crumbling to pieces day after day. Like basically every single thing we discover historically, anthropologically, biologically, that destroys culturalism every single day, right? And I still don't know how spread this idea is, but I've seen it somewhere indirectly. Most people do not even properly understand what the whole thing is about. But anyhow, the point was exactly this approximate symmetry that von Clausewitz spots between the Western militaries these times, but especially, and within the most important thing of the passages is in turn the most important, the second one, that is that the warlike element now is inflamed by great national interests, right, and has broken through artificial limits and now flows in its natural channel. Right, so this is, a more political statement than before, because what are these artificial limits? Evidently, these are political and social structures that had kept compressed these powers, at least, up to a certain point. At the moment they could serve in this regard. I have, that this would require also another very powerful historical digression about the passage from the Ancien Regime, the nation state. How much is that, the revolutions or the brutal upheavals that passed through Napoleonic wars as well, with exportation of republican model, at least this national state ideal decline eventually in every country, kind of in a different way, were to be considered, teleologically speaking, or at least if times were times. It's obvious that there's not a fully linear process in this regard. It's obvious that the same restoration proved that, after all, something could still be compressed in that regard. The French Revolution broke out for reasons that, might have not taken place, and the change might have taken place somewhere else. But in any case, or at least in other modalities. But the point here is that von Clausewitz is pointing out the magnitude of in fact, of the great national interests that now are channeled properly into warfare in a way it had never been seen before. Right, and this is what more properly motivates the way Western warfare fundamentally worked, but also much more than that, including the need for properly realizing that these systems also, this dynamic has deep changes within the same states, and the political awareness on the employment of the military instruments that this entail. Von Clausewitz says this general idea of the modern battle will be useful to us in the sequel in more places than one if we want to estimate the value of the particular coefficients of strength, counter, etc. It is only for general, great, and decisive combats, and such as come near to them, that this description stands good. Right, so this is a picture that we will always have to keep in mind when we realize why, in spite, the nature of warfare is more or less like this, still naturally, every war is different. Every outcome is unpredictable by a large margin. How even those tribal peoples we were talking about before were defeating actually Western armies in many ways. In the 18th century, it had happened particularly often, right? And there is a lot to talk about in this regard that we will hopefully do. We still don't talk in detail about modern warfare, but we will have to expand in it at some point. But the problem here is rather assessing the fact that there is a stage of achievement in the realization of what the means of a country of the Western with Western characteristics at the times, but that is become fundamentally, in most of our world today, right, together, in fact, even with the Clausewitzian theory, prevalent, right, if not dominating after all. So we are in a phase in which we haven't actually driven away from the narrower point of reference that von Clausewitz uses to make an example. And still, by definition, we haven't come out from the theory of the art of war as von Clausewitz draws it, because that's exactly what it is, and that's permanent within humanity in its characters, and has nothing to do whether we want to accept von Clausewitz or not. He just told to them what it is, right? And if we want to accept it, better. Otherwise, you'll be losing wars literally because of that. But still, what von Clausewitz is even exemplifying here in a more practical sense for making us understand about his own type of warfare is actually much closer to us than we want to accomplish, because we think now we are special, as we were saying before. Why? Because we went through 2 world wars, or we have nuclear weapons. This doesn't change much. The point von Clausewitz makes is exactly the same, and actually the Clausewitzian paradigm is confirmed by everything we see happening in the world. So we don't have much to it's easier for us to accept it. Like, it's better. You actually have an explanation of what is going on thanks to this work, even your own world, and you have to discredit it. Why? Because you presume you're modern, this person is not. That's plain stupidity, that there is no other way of putting it, right? That there is no other valid reason for it. And while it's remarkable to try to understand better what is going on, specifically in our world today, this has nothing to do with denying what von Clausewitz said, because it's exactly what he told you to do all the time. Like, war is a universal fashion the same. You have just to understand case by case how it unfolds, right? That's not an anti-Clausewitzian concept. That's literally a Clausewitzian one. That's why it's kept being confirmed, because it's, aside from the credit we have attribute to von Clausewitz, that's literally it's banal, if you want, because that's what we should have realized it for now. Like, if it hadn't been von Clausewitz, if von Clausewitz had been shot down by a cannonball during various campaigns, we wouldn't have the Vom Kriege. But by this time, I presume someone should have come up with something at least similar, at least that would deal with the thing in that manner. We don't know. Like, it's possible even that this would have not happened, but thankfully we do, and it's kind of silly to exclude this just because our feelings are hurt. Like, nobody cares about your feelings as long as they can't ignore that. So, and especially from an intellectual point of view, that's literally the least important thing, what you really feel like. But you have to evidence things reasonably and with backing them with evidence. But aside from that, von Clausewitz concludes, it is only for general, great, and decisive combats and such as come near to them that this description stands good, right? So, once again, the character of this the modern battle is mostly related is most closer to the strategic dimension, still within the tactical spectrum than anything. So it's really about, as we've seen before, this general picture, this general tone, as he puts that, and this essence, complexive essence of the combat. And von Clausewitz writes, inferior combats have changed their character also in the same direction, but less than great ones. So, yeah, and this is true. To tell you the truth, I'm studying a lot of battles recently for my work, and there is an obvious difference, like in many different epochs, between the degree in which greater combats change compared to differ compared to the smaller ones. The smaller ones have more often way more, way greater differences in outcome between one another and dynamic. The greater the combats are, and ultimately even when you transition to strategy, the things tend to homogenize. This is also what von Clausewitz wrote. So, in military historical terms, that's something I can't easily be observed, and until you don't do the work, however, it's as if you hear this for the first time. You don't have the sensitivity for it, but I can assure you that it's really like that. So here, as you understand, von Clausewitz is making a point once again for a broader theory of the art of war, not just because of saying this is just specific to modern battle, and this gets confirmed over and over again. And von Clausewitz also writes the proof of this belongs to tactics for sure, because that all depends on the tactical analysis, which is exactly what I'm carrying out myself in that regard. And we shall, he says, however, have an opportunity hereafter of making this subject plainer by giving a few particulars. So we will have to see it eventually. But this was all for today. And I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.